Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our brand new study in the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to begin with an introduction. And I'm going to look at three different introductions so we get a good overview. Let's go to block one. Look at the introduction from Dr. Rockman from 2017. John Mark first appears in Acts 12:12, where his mother's home is used as a church in Jerusalem. In Mark 14, he may have been the one who fled from the Garden of Gethsemane. John Mark's mother, Mary, was a sister to Barnabas, so John Mark was either a nephew or a cousin to Barnabas. Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. However, halfway into the trip, Mark quit and returned to Jerusalem. Mark's participation became a source of conflict for Paul and Barnabas in getting ready for their second missionary journey. Barnabas wanted to give Mark another chance. Paul said no, so Barnabas took Mark to Cyprus. Paul took Silas to Macedonia and Greece. Mark eventually becomes the disciple of Simon Peter. He becomes a disciple of Simon Peter. In 1 Peter 5:13, Peter calls Mark my son. And as a contemporary of the disciples, Mark would have been very familiar with the teachings of Christ and the miracles of Christ as taught by Simon Peter. Now, Scofield dates the gospel to around AD 68, just after the death of Simon Peter. And the Gospel of Mark does reflect Simon Peter's point of view. And it's divided into the following outline. 1 through 13 is the introduction to public ministry. 1:14 to 13:37, the work of Christ as servant. Chapters 14 and 15, Christ's obedience unto death. And 16, resurrection and ascension. Let's go on and take a look at the excellent introduction in Block 2 by James Edwards. All right, this is by James Edwards, Mark as earliest gospel. For 17 centuries, the church regarded Matthew as the earliest gospel, but then in the early 19th century, the value of Mark took a radical shift. Mark was designated the earliest gospel, this is called the theory of Markan priority. It is called the theory of Markan priority. Mark was a skilled literary writer and a very skilled theologian in his own right. Mark as skilled theologian, for Mark, Jesus is the authoritative and the suffering Son of God. The first reference to John Mark as the author of the gospel came from the bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor in AD 130. It was affirmed by Irenaeus in the 2nd century. So although not an apostle, Mark was a faithful interpreter of Simon Peter's testimony. So he's known as the faithful interpreter of Simon Peter. We read from Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century, those present in Rome exhorted Mark to make a record of what Peter said, and Mark did this. Peter and Paul both laid the foundation for the church in Rome. Mark's gospel is called the Memoirs of Peter. From the end of the 1st century, Mark is a testimony to the gospel of Simon Peter. Now, Mark became the bishop of Alexandria. Mark became the bishop of Alexandria. He evangelized in Egypt, eventually becoming bishop. The gospel is dated after the death of Peter and Paul in Rome, and it's really a 4-year span. We don't know exactly, but James Edwards says somewhere between 64 to 68 AD it should be dated. So very early. Remember, Galatians is the first book of the New Testament. It's dated AD 50. If you date this AD 64, this came 14 years after Galatians. Galatians was and is the gospel of Paul. That's the first gospel. Mark, or the gospel of Peter, is the second gospel. It comes 14 years after Galatians. Let's go to block 3 and take a look at John MacArthur, companion to Peter. Mark was a close companion to Simon Peter. In Acts, he is referred to as John Mark. When Peter was released from prison, he went to John Mark's mother's house in Jerusalem. First missionary journey, Mark was the cousin to Barnabas. He accompanied Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, but he left at Perga and returned to Jerusalem. Therefore, Paul refused to take him on the second missionary journey. Later, Mark and Paul were reconciled. Peter referred to Mark as Mark, my son. In AD 140, the church fathers unanimously affirmed John Mark as the author of the gospel and as the interpreter of Peter. John Mark is the author, and he is the interpreter of the theology of Peter. In AD 150, the Gospel of Mark was referred to as the memoirs of Peter. The Gospel is dated around 67 to 68 AD, prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So it's dated after the death of Peter, but before the destruction of the temple. 64 to 68 AD is a rough estimate. John MacArthur prefers the latter. He prefers 68. I think James Edwards prefers 64, but it's in that range, 64 to 68, roughly 14 years after Galatians. Galatians still remains the first gospel. It's the gospel of Paul. Then comes Mark, which is the gospel of Peter, 14 years after Galatians. So Mark is the second gospel, but it's not the second gospel after Matthew. No, it's the second gospel after Galatians. Galatians is the gospel according to Paul. Mark is the gospel according to Peter. Our first two gospels are by Paul and Simon Peter. AD 50 and then AD 64. This comes 14 years after Galatians. And all scholars recognize that Mark is other than Galatians, Mark is the earliest. Matthew, Luke, and John all borrow from Mark. They all borrow from Mark. Mark is the earliest. They all borrow from Mark. But Mark was a disciple of Simon Peter. Everything he did because the churches in Rome asked him, please write down everything that Peter is teaching. So it was the church members in Rome that were begging Mark, a scholar, a very intelligent man, please record everything that Peter is teaching us so we'll have a permanent record. And then Mark agreed to do this, and he wrote the Gospel of Mark after the death of Simon Peter, somewhere between AD 64 and AD 68. So it's technically it's entitled the Gospel of Mark, but it's in reality it is the Gospel of Simon Peter. And it follows Galatians. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use all three of these commentaries when we do our study in Mark, because Rockman is a fundamentalist. He's going to be very good for scripture cross-referencing. Edwards is a academic scholar. And MacArthur kind of falls between fundamentalism and scholarship. He's kind of in between Rockman and Edwards. So I want all three perspectives, so I picked up all three commentaries, and that way it's going to give me a good overview, and I'll be able to look at the gospel from different perspectives. But Rockman is a strict fundamentalist, very, very scripture-based. James Edwards is a contemporary biblical scholar, very, very highly regarded as a biblical scholar. MacArthur kind of falls between those two extremes. So I think those three we will use as we go throughout the study. And as usual, we will study the original Greek. So we look at Rockman, Edwards, and MacArthur, and the original Greek in every section of Scripture that we examine. That gives us a very good introduction, and not a lot of time used here, but this gives us an introduction from all three commentaries, and it gets us a good beginning. And we should realize that this is entitled the Gospel of Mark, but it is in fact the Gospel according to Simon Peter, and it follows Galatians chronologically. It comes 14 years after Galatians, and Galatians is the theological gospel of Paul. So if you put your New Testament in chronological order, you would begin with the theological gospel of Paul, Galatians. Then you would have the gospel of Simon Peter as the gospel of Mark, second. That's going to get us started. We'll pick up in chapter 1 next lesson, but that gets us started with our introduction to the Gospel of Mark.